This lecture will cover the most famous war from antiquity, the War of Troy, and the fall of Troy in the aftermath. Now, the story of the Trojan War is actually merely a poetic account, not about actual events, but instead human choices and the tragic consequences of those choices. The reason for this is that we do not have written record from the Bronze Age when this war likely occurred. In fact, up until 1870, Homer's Iliad and the account of the Trojan War was considered as myth by those, of course, that study literature and ancient cultures. This was until Heinrich Schliemann, a German archaeologist, discovered Troy in, once again, the 19th century and confirmed that there's a 13th century BCE city that had been razed to the ground. Now, the Aegean civilization had disappeared by Homer's time. Thus, the stories surrounding this great battle were transformed into the golden age of heroes, that of Achilles and others. Now, the kings leading the expedition from the house of Atreus ruled the Argive plain at this time, which is the backstory. After Perseus's line ended was Eurystheus, who of course is going to be the tormentor of Heracles. We find that the Heraclids are going to end up killing him, thus avenging their father. The descendants, of course, from Tantalus were all cursed, and thus we have the series of tragic events that will eventually lead to the deaths of those associated with the Trojan War. As we noted, Tantalus had invited the gods to a banquet to test their omniscience if they actually knew everything, and chopped up his own son Pelops, serving him as a stew. All of the gods but Demeter knew what had happened, so they did not eat it, but Demeter, stricken with grief, ate his shoulder. Zeus had Hermes put pieces in a pot and boil it, and out came the fresh child, and had Hephaestus make a prosthetic shoulder of ivory for him. Oenomaus, the king of Pisa in the northwest Peloponnesus, where we have the site of the Olympic Games, is going to be central to the myth that follows. As the myth goes, Oenomaus is in love with his own beautiful daughter, Hippodamia, although she refuses to have sex with him. Therefore, he prevents others from marrying her by offering her as a prize in an unwinnable contest, a race. Here we can see the pediment of the sculptures that faced the opening of the Olympic Games, warning people not to cheat, for that's exactly what this story is about. Like Atalanta, we find that he would have a suitor carry her away on a chariot, much as we have seen so many abductions, such as Hades and Persephone before. He would give them a head start like Atalanta had, but then come up from behind and spear them, cutting off their head and nailing their head to the door of his palace as a warning. Pelops, of course, this child, which was reassembled by Zeus and Hephaestus, is now grown, and with a golden winged chariot drawn by Poseidon's horses, who remember is the god of horses, he invented them, he bribes the king's groom, Myrtilus, by promising that this groom would have the first night in bed with Hippodamia. Therefore, he rigged the royal chariot to fail by removing the axle pins. The wheels, of course, flew off, and Oenomaus was dragged to death. Now, after this, he stops for water, and Myrtilus tried to claim the reward promised to him, that being Hippodamia. But Pelops instead threw him from a cliff. But as he fell, he cursed all of Pelops's line. And, as we know from antiquity, a dying man's curse is the most effective. Pelops then returns to Pisa and is named this area Peloponnesus after himself, the island of Pelops. He had many sons, and then the oracle ordered the Mycenaeans to choose one of Pelops' sons as the new king. Atreus is the older brother, while Thyestes is going to declare that a token was needed in order to successfully be named king. The example he gives is a golden fleece. Atreus agrees because years before he had hid a golden fleece in his trunk instead of burning it to Artemis like he was supposed to. Only his wife Eriope knew where it was. However, she had already secretly given it to Thyestes because they had a love affair together. Atreus knew that Zeus wanted him to be king, so the next day he said the sun would rise in the west. Of course it did, because Zeus wanted him to be king, and he then banished Thyestes. But in doing so, he discovers his wife's infidelity when considering how he had the fleece to begin with, and only she knew. Therefore, he invites the brother back for revenge, murdering his boys, cutting off their extremities, and roasting the trunks, serving them in a banquet. He then shows the heads and limbs after he had eaten them. Thyestes fled, cursing Atreus and his line. At this point of the story, the Delphic oracle informed him that he must beget a child with his own daughter, Pelopeia, to get his revenge, but he didn't know where she was. Traveling, he comes across a girl at the water whom he rapes and drops his sword. They did not know one another, and Atreus soon takes her as his wife, not knowing she was his niece, or that she was pregnant with Aegisthus, Thyestes' son. A year later, Atreus sent his older sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus, who will be very important in the Trojan War, to the oracle to discover Thyestes there as well. They seize him and bring him back and condemn him to death by Aegisthus' hands, his own son. But he recognizes the sword. He called Pelopeia, who recognized the truth, and then she grabs the sword and kills herself. With the blood on the sword as proof of the execution, Aegisthus returns and knifed Atreus in the back. Thyestes is now king, and Agamemnon and Menelaus flee to Sparta, where King Tyndareus is sympathetic to their plight, mounting a campaign to reclaim their land. And of course they win, making Agamemnon king. Now Tyndareus will marry Leda, whom Zeus had seduced as he transforms himself into a swan, a very popular motif in the Renaissance. And in the same night, Tyndareus will have sex with her, and Zeus will as well. Thus they have 4 offspring. Much like the myth of Heracles, one egg that she lays, because Zeus was in the form of a swan, is going to contain Odysseus and Helen, Zeus's semi-divine children, while the other egg is going to contain Castor and Clytemnestra, who are both mortal. At this stage, the Dioscuri, or Castor and Polydeuces, often known as Pollux, were the twin sons of Leda and the brothers of Helen of Troy and Clytemnestra. These are the ones known as the Gemini, which is Latin for twins, where we get the constellation and or the zodiac. When Castor died, because he was mortal, Pollux gave up half of his immortality. Thus they will live in Hades and on Olympus on alternating days. That's thus what twins do for one another. Tyndareus then marries Clytemnestra to Agamemnon, but worries that Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, would cause bloodshed. Now, Helen has many suitors, the famous ones, of course, that we know from the Trojan War, including Odysseus, Diomedes, Ajax, which is the second best warrior in Greece after Achilles, Philoctetes, who lights Hercules' funeral pyre and receives his bow, Patroclus, who will be Achilles' best friend, Menelaus, and many more. Odysseus is rejected initially because he is too poor, but as the story goes, we will see moving forward, Odysseus is a trickster and very intelligent, so he invents a solution. The Oath of Tyndareus, stating that the victor can rely on my giving support in defense of this marriage. If anyone carried her off, all of the suitors together must join in the pursuit. Now the marriage, of course, is already doomed at this point, but we have Peleus and brother Telamon being envious of their half-brother Phocus, who they murder. Acus is exiling them on pain of death due to this murder. Telamon flees to Salamis, where he fathers Ajax. Upon hearing Prometheus's prophecy, Zeus is going to arrange Thetis to marry Peleus. Now, Peleus is going to need to be quite agile to capture Thetis, who is a water nymph. He must pin her down and cling onto her tightly, as seen here, for she can change into every form imaginable. She turns into fire, a tree, a lion, bird, but finally returns to a womanly form and agrees to marry him. Hera is so grateful that Thetis did not sleep with Zeus that she gives her the most splendid wedding ever. Of course, not everyone is invited. Eris, or Strife, is resentful that she is not invited to this wedding. So she rolls an apple across the floor and cries, "May the most beautiful goddess take it." Later, this turns into "to the fairest of them all," as of course is seen over and over in several folktale motifs. Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena all are making quite a ruckus and are being very distracting in this wedding. So Zeus orders them to be quiet and present them for impartial appraisal before Paris, the son of the Trojan king Priam, for he, of course, does not want to judge a beauty contest where his wife is involved and judged against the goddess of love and beauty. Now, the Trojans at this point come into play because they share the same gods and customs as the Greeks. We know that King Priam and Queen Hecabe are going to create Hector, their son, the greatest warrior of the Trojans. Their other son is Paris. After her first child, Hector, Hecabe has a dream where she gives birth to a firebrand. A seer explains that the next child she will have would destroy Troy. Priam, fearing this, orders the child to be exposed and die, just like Oedipus was. But, just like Oedipus, a shepherd finds him and raises him, calling him Paris. Awaking from a nap, he finds a series of quarreling goddesses in front of him. Each undress and offer him a bribe in order to receive the title of the fairest of them all. Hera offers him dominion over the whole world. Athena offers him a glorious military career, while finally Aphrodite offers him the most beautiful woman in the world. Obviously, he chooses the most beautiful woman, very poorly, we might add. The one caveat she fails to mention here is that she's already married to the king of Sparta. This is going to be a very popular motif and subject in art that spans many centuries, for it offers the opportunity to show three different types of female beauty and nudity. So we find that Paris is often shown giving the apple to Aphrodite in exchange for Helen, the most beautiful woman. He then takes a ship to Sparta to claim his prize, where the king of Sparta, Menelaus, receives him graciously, because Xenia demands that he take care of and protect guests. Now, the king then leaves for a funeral on Crete. In the meantime, Paris is said to seduce or take by force Helen, the most beautiful woman. Paris and Helen are said to have gathered the treasure of the palace and leave, eloping back to Troy. They leave behind, of course, her husband and her daughter. Various scenes are going to show her either be going willingly or taken forcibly. In the Iliad, one version is she is not willing to go, but she is a prize that Paris has won by way of Aphrodite. At this point, the king of Sparta discovers this and appeals to his brother, the king of Mycenae. The brothers then invoke the oath of Tyndareus. Thus the former suitors are assembled with their armies at Aulis, except for Odysseus, who was happy at home on Ithaca with his wife and his new son. Palamedes is sent as an emissary and finds Odysseus pretending to be insane and plowing a field. He takes, of course, at this point to call his bluff. Palamedes takes Odysseus' new son and throws him before the plow, forcing Odysseus to stop. Now, Odysseus never forgets this, because later he'll get revenge on Palamedes by planting Trojan gold in his tent. He will be stoned to death as a traitor. Callas, the expedition seer on the Trojan War, stated that in order for the Greeks to win, they needed Achilles. Achilles will become the greatest warrior of the Greeks and face many challenges along the way to the Trojan War. As an infant, Thetis, his mother, burned away the mortal portions on the hearth of him, much like Demeter had earlier in the myth we discussed with fertility. In a later version, she dips him into the river Styx, holding only his heel. And of course, this is where we get the idea that never would he be wounded except for his heel, where we get the term an Achilles heel. Otherwise, he is invincible. Achilles, like Jason, is then given to Chiron, the centaur, to be educated and also to learn how to hunt with his companion Patroclus. When his mother is going to find that he is grown, she hides him in the women's quarters of their home, dressing him like a girl so as he will not be forced to go to war. Of course, this story is going to also involve Odysseus, the clever trickster. He, along with Diomedes, are going to pretend to be peddlers of dainty things for the king's daughters. They leave a sword and shield nearby and announce that pirates are attacking. Obviously, Achilles, being a great warrior, immediately seizes the weapons and prepares to fight, thus exposing himself as a man. Now the Greeks had their greatest warrior Achilles and were ready to sail to Troy, but there was a problem. No one knew exactly where Troy was. So they sailed to Troad, near Troy, and Achilles then skirmishes and wounds the local king Telephus. Now, it would not heal this wound, and so the oracle tells him, only that which harmed you can cure you. Thus, this is where we get the term the hair of the dog, for, of course, using alcohol to chase away a hangover. We find that Telephus is going to sail to Greece and agrees to be the guide of the Greeks if Achilles would but heal him. At that point, Achilles scrapes off the corrosion of his spear that wounded him, and he was healed at once. Agamemnon at this stage causes the Greeks to be further delayed, for he had killed an animal belonging to Artemis at her temple, or in another account he bragged that he was a better hunter than Artemis. Either way, he greatly offends the goddess, so Artemis causes the winds to blow in the wrong direction, so they can't make it to Troy. The seer, Colossus, is going to determine that Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, must be sacrificed to appease the goddess Artemis. They are told that she would then marry Achilles to lure her to the site of the altar. Upon her arrival, she's quickly led to the altar and her throat is cut, just like with any other animal sacrifice. In a later version, Artemis is going to allow a deer to be substituted. This is much like the story of Athamas and Phrixus, who is led to an altar, and the knife is going to almost reach his neck when a golden ram appears beside the altar, just like in Genesis 22. As with this story, we have the sacrifice of one's daughter in order to appease the gods, in order to get what one wants. The wind now is going to blow in a fair direction to get them to Troy. So they sail to an island to take on fresh water and sacrifice to the gods again. Philoctetes at this point is bitten on the foot by a snake. The entire Greek fleet sails on without him, but his wound continues to fester and run with pus. So they abandon him on the island of Lemnos, the sacred island of Hephaestus. He is given the bow of Heracles to survive by hunting small game, and this will come back into the story later, for they must return to get this bow. The oracle is going to announce that once they land, the first one to step foot on Troy would die. So Protolaus is going to leap from his ship, and Hector cuts him down, just as the oracle had predicted. Not wishing for further bloodshed, Odysseus, the great orator and speaker, along with Menelaus, the king of Sparta, whose wife had been stolen, goes to the city of Troy to ask for her return to settle this without further bloodshed. They are both nearly killed, thus we find fighting and hostilities begin here. In art, we see that we have a game of dice on the eve of battle with Troy, which of course is outside the literary tradition. This will foretell the death of Ajax and the triumphant winnings and successes of Achilles. The irony in these examples is that Achilles is going to win this game, but will die in battle, and Ajax is going to commit suicide in despair shortly thereafter. Now, Homer's Iliad is the best source for the Trojan War, but of the 10 years of battle, it only chronicles the last one. Now, Chryseis, the priest of Apollo, comes to Agamemnon to get his daughter Chryseis back, who had been taken as war booty. He is denied, given the heroic code of the Greeks, where war booty is coveted above all else, as it is a visible sign of a man's honor, what they had accomplished. The priest then has Apollo send a plague of arrows of disease that decimates the Greek ranks. The seer Callas is going to inform the Greeks that they must give up this girl and that will save them. At a public assembly, he agrees, but that being Agamemnon agrees to give them up, but he announces that he will take someone else's slave. The one he chooses, very unfortunately, is Achilles, who reminds him that all the girls had been assigned. So Agamemnon takes his, Briseis. He prepares to kill Agamemnon when Athena appears only to him, and also urged by Hera, who cares for both men, not to kill him. So Athena convinces Achilles to harm him with words instead. Therefore, Achilles states he will kill Agamemnon eventually. Achilles is going to beg Thetis, his mother, for revenge. So his mother asks Zeus to harm the Greeks. He owes her a favor, and so he agrees. In fighting with full fury, Hector is going to then return to the city to see his wife Andromache and infant son Astyanax for the last time, and then returns to battle. This is very popular as Hector is a heroic character, fighting only to save his land. He did not take Helen. He was not part of this transgression, so he is shown as a good husband and father. Zeus, unfortunately, then grants Thetis' request, giving the Trojans victory. Agamemnon offers Achilles an enormous reward to come back and fight with them to give the Greeks an advantage again. Achilles turns him down, stating that as much as I hate the gates of Hades, do I hate a man who says one thing and secretly thinking another. So here we find that Briseis is going to be returned now to Achilles in order to make right what Agamemnon had done. Patroclus, Achilles' best friend and tentmate, begs him to relent so that the Greeks would not keep dying in battle. At the very least, he asks that he get to wear Achilles' armor so as to appear Achilles is actually in the battle, thus rallying the Greeks. We find that Achilles agrees but warns Patroclus to stay away from the city walls. Patroclus is, of course, going to kill many of the Trojans in the guise of Achilles, including Sarpedon, the son of Zeus. But he forgets Achilles' warning and is cornered and killed by Hector, who strips him of his armor and puts it on himself. This is a great insult, but one that is appropriate, for you take the armor from your defeated foe, showing you are greater than them. Here, as we discussed, Sarpedon is going to be killed, and we find that Patroclus is the one who kills him. So Zeus, in turn, has Hector kill Patroclus in this quid pro quo. Grief-stricken upon hearing that Patroclus has been killed, Thetis is going to bring new armor made by Hephaestus to Achilles to avenge him. This is when we have the great action sequence in the Iliad with Achilles mowing down the Trojans and fighting Hector. He flies into a blood rage after his friend has been killed, wiping out Trojans across the battlefield. They retreat back behind the walls, but Hector alone stays to face him. The battle of Hector versus Achilles has been represented over and over again in art, for they are the two greatest warriors pitted against one another. But of course Achilles will win. He is the greater warrior. He stabs Hector in the throat, luckily missing his vocal cords. So Hector begs for an honorable burial, but Achilles says he would rather eat Hector's flesh. Hector then prophesies that Achilles will die soon after Hector does. Then Achilles, having killed his adversary who had murdered his friend in combat, Hector is going to be tied to the back of the chariot of Achilles and dragged around the plain for days to showcase the greatest warrior has fallen. Patroclus then receives a splendid funeral set up by Achilles. Achilles, as part of the funeral, is going to cut 10 Trojan captives' throats over the pyre, sacrifice for the dead, especially those that die in war, so they won't come back and haunt you. Many animals also were sacrificed at the same time. Priam, the king, attempts to ransom his son Hector's corpse, so he can also give him a proper burial, but Achilles refuses. And this is the last line of the Iliad. And so they buried horse-taming Hector once eventually Achilles agrees. The later events that you're familiar with in the story of the Trojan War are summarized in a series of cyclic poems. With Hector dead, we find that the allies of the Trojans come to their assistance. One of them is the Amazonian queen, who is killed by Achilles. Now we find that one of the Greeks takes pity on her. Thersites is going to be the ugliest man who ever went to Troy, as described in the Iliad, derides Achilles for killing a woman. Therefore, Achilles kills him in turn. Now, the Trojan War is going to thus see the death of Achilles in these later poems, when supposedly Paris is going to fire an arrow guided by Apollo, who is the god of Troy, and hits Achilles in the heel, the one point and part of his body that was not invulnerable to attack, just as his mother had dipped him in the river Styx. There's a great battle after Achilles is killed by Paris. They all surround the body, wanting it as proof of the greatest warrior. So Ajax is going to throw the corpse of Achilles over his shoulder as the second greatest warrior. He fights his way back to the Greek lines through arrow fire, very heroically. His body is then burned and mixed with ashes in a jar with that of Patroclus in a grand funeral. Achilles' armor is then offered as a prize to the next best warrior, which Ajax was. But Odysseus, the silver-tongued devil that he was, makes a speech where the Trojan prisoners as well claim that it was Odysseus' intelligence rather than Ajax's brawn that harmed them more. Enraged, Ajax is going to attack the captains of the Greek army, thinking he is attacking them, but then realizes he'd actually attacked a flock of sheep and is humiliated, being covered head to toe with their blood. Shamed and without the armor, he walks away to a cave, throwing himself on his sword, which is a later Roman addition because this is how Romans commit suicide if they're honorable and lost a battle. Still enraged in the underworld, he refuses to speak to Odysseus, and we'll talk about that next class. With both the heroes dead, the war drags on and on. Callas is going to state that the war, the seer that is, states that the war will only be won if three conditions are going to be abided by. Number one, Achilles' son Neoptolemus is going to join the battle. He is known as the young fighter, is what his name means, and is conceived when Achilles was in the women's quarters. We find that number two, the protective statue of Athena must be stolen from the Trojan city. This will be done by Odysseus and Diomedes. And finally, the bow of Heracles must be returned, and so Odysseus and Neoptolemus are going to go back and retrieve it. We find that the bow is going to be given up. In the later tradition, the son of Asclepius is going to heal, once again, Philoctetes. And this will be the bow that is going to be used to shoot Achilles in the foot by Paris. But still, the city does not fall. Odysseus then comes up with the idea, thanks to Athena, of constructing a wooden horse that will hold 50 warriors, much like the Argo with Jason and the Argonauts that we'll talk about shortly. After building the horse, the Greeks burn their own tents and pretend to sail away. They instead hide behind the islands of Tenedos. They then send out a Greek spy named Sinon to explain to the Trojans that the Greeks had given up and sailed home. The horse was in fact an offering to Athena, and of course was a human sacrifice presented to the Trojans, and so they killed Sinon so that the Greeks could get back safely. However, the priest of Poseidon Laocoon declared that Sinon was a liar, stating, "Beware Greeks, even when they bear gifts. Thus you should not accept gifts from one's enemies." He said that they should destroy it and hurl the spear into the horse's side. 2 serpents arose from the sea at this time, and of course killed Laocoon famously. Now, the great statue of the Laocoon that is unearthed in 1506 in Nero's Domus Aurea will be one of the most influential works of all of the 16th century and leads to the creation of the Sistine Chapel ceiling by Michelangelo. The twisted, writhing forms are very expressive and are appropriate for the Hellenistic age. Now, in Virgil's Aeneid, he states that Laocoon instead is actually punished for having sex within the temple of Poseidon, instead of blaspheming the Greeks' plan and telling them to destroy it. In this instance, you find that the Laocoon and his sons shows that this is the product of his defiling of a sacred temple, and that's why he is dying. A very popular motif, this notion of someone who is only trying to protect their home, but instead is tragically punished by a divine entity, is going to resonate with many cultures. The form of the Laocoon is actually taken from the giant from the altar of Zeus at Pergamon, and so we see the same types of forms repeated that are expressing anguish and pain. Now, with this finished, the Trojans take the Trojan horse into their city and celebrate the end of the war. At which time the Greeks came out at night and hunted down and killed all the Trojan men, taking the women captive and burning their city. In the play by Euripides, The Trojan Women, of 415 BCE, we find an anti-war play that surrounds the massacre again that we discussed in Melos, when we talked about Heracles and Same, where the Athenians sold women and children into slavery, while the men were butchered beside the altar, beheaded next to their brides, who were dragged away as a trophy, as breeders of the sons of the Argives. The death of King Priam comes at the hands of Achilles' own son, Neoptolemus. He is murdered at the altar of Zeus, as Homer writes, plunged it right to the hilt, deep into the bowels of Priam. Menelaus, of course, the king of Sparta, finds his wife Helen in a bedroom with her new husband, who is the other son of Priam. He kills and mutilates him and is about to kill Helen too. But she bares her breasts and pleads for her life, saying he would kill her later instead. The two would live happily ever after, in fact, and Helen would return to Sparta as the queen. The other Ajax, who did not commit suicide, raped Cassandra, the muse and oracle of Apollo, who was cursed to always tell the truth and no one would believe her. Now, he raped her while she clung to the image of Athena. Thus, just as with the story of Medusa, Athena is angry at this, for it is defiling a sacred place, and so she will curse the Greeks for it. Only a few Trojan males, in fact, escaped: Aeneas, Anchises, and Ascanius. They are going to find the women, herding them together, and the Greeks will then distribute the ones they found among the heroes, while Aeneas escapes with those few that still remain to found Rome. Odysseus commanded Astyanax, Hector's son, to be torn from Andromache's bosom and thrown from the walls of Troy. For he states, only a fool kills the father and allows the son to live. For here we have the fear of retribution, of a son coming of age and returning to seek vengeance on those that killed his father. Neoptolemus then carries Polyxena, Priam's youngest daughter, to the tomb of Achilles and cuts her throat in order to ensure that he is satiated in the afterlife and that his vengeful spirit will not come back to haunt those associated with his death. And this, of course, is what a family does for a family. So this is his son doing this for him. Then we have the nostoi, or the homecoming genre, which tells of what happens to heroes upon returning, where we get the word nostalgia or homesickness. They wish to go home. In the trilogy Aeschylus, we have the most extensive record of what happens. For Agamemnon returns, but finds his wife having an affair with his cousin Aegisthus. His ship is just one of a few to survive a storm caused by Athena, who wishes to avenge the rape of Cassandra on her statue. Agamemnon arrives with his mistress and prize, Cassandra. Clytemnestra lures him with a purple cloth, much like a red carpet to walk on, and like Deianira and Medea, kills them both. She defends her action as revenge for their daughter's sacrifice, Iphigenia, before leaving for the Trojan War. In the second play, Agamemnon's son Orestes is ordered by the Delphic oracle to return to Argos with his friend Pylades and avenge his father's murder by killing his mother. In the night before this, Clytemnestra has a dream that she gives birth to a viper that sucked at her breast and then bit her. She sent her daughter Electra to, once again, his grave for offerings, that being Agamemnon's grave, where she met Orestes. He pretended to be a messenger to report his own death. Orestes kills Aegisthus, then Clytemnestra, where she pleads again for her life by once again baring her breasts as Helen had. The Furies immediately surround him and drive him into madness. He returns to the Delphic oracle for Apollo's orders, since it was Apollo who told him to commit the murder. We find Apollo then sends Orestes to be judged in Athens by Athena. The Furies claim the right to torment those who spill family blood. Athena decides after the trial that Orestes was in the right, which is very telling for Greek civilization at this time. The argument was the Furies did not attack Clytemnestra because she did not share blood with Agamemnon. Orestes did not shed family blood because the child's blood, according to the Greeks, comes from the father who plants the seed in the mother. The mother is considered only the soil. Therefore, it's not, again, shedding this type of familial blood. Thus cleansed by Apollo, Orestes rules Mycenae, Argos and Sparta, and marries Hermione, Helen's daughter. The next class, we will turn to Odysseus and more of these homecomings, this nostalgic longing for home with Odysseus and his 10-year journey to get back to Ithaca, to his family.